Well, folks, here we are. It's January 24th, 2025, and Frank Seravalli just published his January edition of the NHL's Trade Targets Board. Let's dive into his scoop as to the number one name and what he actually talks about. Let's go over whether or not this is actually to be believed and how it could have gotten to this. As always, the show is brought to you by ExpressVPN. Go out there and check the first link in the description if you want to save some money on your VPN and get some free months. You'll also be helping out the channel in the process. But also linked in the description is going to be the Daily Face-Off Trade Board. Take a look at this. The Canucks' JT Miller will remain number one on the trade targets board until he is traded. So, based off of that, it doesn't seem like anybody is going to dethrone JT on the board until the guy is gone. That's literally what it says here. Frank Seravalli writes, the number one name, JT Miller, Canucks, 31 years old, 37 games played, 8 goals, 25 assists for 33 points. He's got 5 years remaining at $8 million AAV. Here's the scoop. Will he? Won't he? Here's the deal. The Canucks seem to have reached a point where they are ready to move on from Miller. Likewise, Miller seems to have reached a point where he is ready to move on from the Canucks. The holdup is that the Canucks are trying to extract the most value possible for a very distressed asset. That's why the Hurricanes, the Bruins, the Devils, and to a lesser extent the Stars have jumped in to check on prices. They're all involved in varying degrees of sincerity. Miller will remain number one until he is moved. JT Miller is starting to look like Robbie Rotten over here because he is number one. And if you look on this article and you look for Elias Pettersson's name, he is down there at number 30. So he is no longer a significant piece of this trade targets board. He was near the top earlier on in the season. Even on the TSN trade board, we remember a few weeks ago we had Miller and Pettersson sharing the number one spot. Well, on dailyfaceoff.com's ranking, EP is now the number 30 guy, Miller is the number 1 guy. Just for the sake of getting things out of the way, let's read the Elias Pettersson scoop. Pettersson seemingly should be marked safe from a trade after the developments with Miller over the weekend. However, the longer the Miller saga drags on, and the more depressed the return is for the Canucks, they may be forced to pivot here and entertain conversations on PD again, which were not surprisingly much more robust. Stay tuned, it's not impossible, not until Pettersson's full no-trade clause kicks in on July 1st. And that makes sense, ultimately. We did see reports from Elliot Friedman that said that Elias Pettersson went to the Canucks management himself. He said, hey, I want to stay, and it seems like Canucks management is also in that boat. They want PD to stick around in Van. And with JT Miller's name being tossed out there in the fire over the weekend, we do recognize that his days as a Canuck are probably more likely to come to an end. It's Miller, not Pettersson. In fact, I do find it kind of funny because Frank Seravalli, I feel, if you look around the tea leaves, you read a lot of the articles, you hear some of the radio hits, I feel like Seravalli, out of anybody else on the insider market, more than Friedman, LeBrun, Drager, Chris Johnston, all these other guys, Seravalli seemed to have been more on the trade Pettersson train rather than the trade Miller train, where all the other insiders and people were talking about, trading JT, it's got to be JT, maybe trade JT. Seravalli was more on the JT is a better player route, trade Pettersson boat instead. But now it's been a few weeks, and of course, Miller is still here, Pettersson is still here, Miller was almost traded, and despite personal subjective feelings earlier on in the season, it seems like Seravalli is now like, okay, yeah, it seems like Miller's going to get traded more. I mean, it's just kind of an interesting dynamic to follow, especially when you look at the variance and how different insiders are talking about this stuff. Now I think most parties are all on the same page. Hey, JT's probably going to get traded. Hey, teams are asking about JT. And unfortunately for the Canucks, teams are not really offering much for JT Miller. As we had heard in yesterday's commentary, we had talked about how teams are telling the Canucks they need to retain salary or asking for a sweetener from Vancouver in order to take on Miller at the full price of $8 million, which at this point, it's now feeling a lot like, man, they just gotta wait until the offseason. This season's a wash. Last year, That season was the outlier. The Vancouver Canucks, with their core, with this group of guys, under 3 different head coaches, Green, Boudreau, and Tocchet, are in a spot where they just can't get things going. And it's been this group of guys for that long. You're wasting a season of Quinn Hughes when he is playing some of the best hockey the defensive position in the sport has ever seen. The Canucks are wasting that. And it's on a product that you could debate. Maybe it could have been better had the locker room issues been sorted out. Maybe it could have been better if the coach was different. Who really knows? If they just traded away somebody earlier on, maybe if they bit the bullet earlier, would they still be in this bad of a position? Would they have been able to get things going? You can say yes, but of course it's a gamble. If you traded away JT Miller earlier on in the season, maybe you would have been able to get a higher return for him, but who in their right mind would have wanted to give up on Miller at that point? Like, it's so unfortunate to see the way the Vancouver Canucks season has gone, because now we are seeing uninspired play. They're just not able to get that fight that they had from last season. They're not able to get that consistency. Sure, I will say roster management plays a part in it. The defense core being as bad as it is this year, especially compared to last year, is a problem. There are many other assets with this team that aren't performing up to snuff. Pettersson, Miller, of course. You can say Thatcher Demko is not pulling his weight. Quinn Hughes and Kevin Lankinen. Add in Kiefer Sherwood in there too. Those are like the 3 guys that have really shown up to play beyond their expectations this season. Everybody else has been kind of at the level we expected them to be, or worse. Miller, Pettersson, Joshua, Garland, Demko. Like, I get it. Some of these guys have had circumstances that garner sympathy. Like, Dakota Joshua had cancer. You can't get too upset about him. But what about all the other guys that didn't get cancer? Elias Pettersson and JT Miller are being paid so much money to provide consistently, and they can't. Elias Pettersson has, 50-something points in his last 82 games? We're at that point in the season now where we can do these year-by-year calculations. And now Miller, Frank Seravalli's writing here, Miller is at that point where he's okay with leaving. Vancouver's at that point where they're okay with getting rid of him. I mean, it's a pretty damning quote, right? Miller seems to have reached a point where he is ready to move on from the Canucks. It's so unfortunate. And until this gets settled, whether it be next week or sometime in the offseason, I don't think the Vancouver Canucks are willing to take themselves seriously as a contender. I don't think fans should be willing to take this team seriously as a contender. They're not. It was crazy last year, you know? Last year was the outlier. But this season has been more so in the realm of consistency with the Vancouver Canucks prior to 2023-2024. 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. These years were all filled with Canucks inconsistencies and inadequacies. And now we're seeing it once again in 2025. So, with the exception of 23-24, I feel like this Canucks team is more or less just where they've always been. And now, with JT Miller potentially being on the way out soon, or definitely being on the way out soon, we just gotta wait and see what happens. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. I hope you enjoyed this video. And bye.